Several years ago, my paternal grandparents died within 4 months of each other. My grandmother in November, and my grandfather in the following March, his funeral on Holy Saturday. Both times, the pastor of their Church of Christ congregation, because all of my family besides my immediate family is Church of Christ, both times their pastor presided over their funerals, but I, both times, was asked to be the one who read the collected remembrances of my families and friends. It was decided without me that I was the only one who would have the wherewithal to keep it all together. Page after page after page, the stories of my grandmother and then my grandfather were revealed, vignettes about him, the preacher, professor, and her, the special ed teacher, the pillars of their communities and of their families. Some stories I knew, but most I didn't. That, of course, is the way of funerals. It is during the eulogies that often we learn surprising things about the people we loved and shared our lives with. Stories are an offering, evidence of a life and a person who is now gone. On Saturday, May 4th, Rachel Held Evans died after spending several weeks in a medically induced coma. She was 37, a wife and mother of 2 children, her oldest 3 and her youngest turned 1 this week. Most knew Rachel because of her blog and her 4 books, Unraveling Faith, originally titled Escaping Monkeytown, A Year of Biblical Womanhood, Searching for Sunday, and her latest and last, Inspired. Rachel's story was familiar while being remarkable. Raised in the evangelical Southern Baptist tradition, she eventually began to push back hard against the hypocrisies and the cruelties of her faith heritage until finally she left the church of her youth and joined the Episcopal tradition. Rachel and I never met, though we were friends on Twitter. But when I read of her death, I wept in my car. So did a lot of my friends. It soon became evident why we were all wrecked. Under a hashtag, Remembering RHE, person after person after person after person after person shared their stories, their offerings, their evidence of her life. She was the reason we discovered that countless women who'd been raised in fundamentalist churches pushed back on their oppression and entered seminaries and became ministers themselves. She was the reason why countless LGBTQ persons rejected the deadly theologies that told them they were anything less than beloved. Why countless LGBTQ persons didn't walk away from the church altogether. She was the reason that countless people of color, especially women of color, got book deals and invitations to speak in conferences and to keynote and were given representation from agencies at all. Over and over and over again, Rachel leveraged her power and position for others. I will not attend her funeral, but on social media in these last few weeks, I have witnessed her eulogy of service. I cannot help but think of her, and this was total happenstance, that in the lectionary we would read the story of Tabitha, a woman whose death causes widespread grief. Tabitha is one of the most remarkable in the New Testament. She is the only one given the official title of disciple. Even Mary and Martha are not described that way. Tabitha has 2 names, which may be an indication that she was possibly powerful and rich enough to be a Roman citizen. She seems to have a house with 2 stories, which I guess is normal for a lot of us, but totally wasn't normal in that time period. It was an indication of her own personal wealth. But that's all we can surmise. We don't know a lot about her, honestly, because the Bible isn't always closely interested in the lives and stories of women. But we do know that she was beloved enough that when she died unexpectedly, 2 followers of Jesus were dispatched to fetch an apostle to perform her funeral. You're a big deal if the apostles come due at your funeral. And when Peter does arrive, so do all of the mourners. Tabitha, also known as Dorcas, is surrounded by mourning widows who hold in their hands the clothing she had made for them, a eulogy of service, and this was profound. It's hard to explain why it's profound to us, because we live in the days of fast fashion, of $5 t-shirts and resale shops full of donated clothing, and they shoot t-shirts out of cannons at you at sporting events. And, you know, the growing ecological crisis caused by fast fashion is a whole other thing. But we don't really understand the value of textiles, especially not in the time of Jesus. Before industrialization, all clothing and textiles have to be made by people, and that means the shearing of the sheep or the collection of the silk or the picking of the cotton and the spinning and the processing and the dyeing and the designing and the stitching, all clothing individually tailored, meant to be used over and over and over and over and over and over again till it fell apart past repair. Even if Tabitha was rich enough to have people working for her, and she may have been, other people doing the majority of the creative labor for the making of the textiles, the gifting of clothing to the poorest people in her culture, widows, is unfathomably generous. And it's not just one widow. It's not 2. It's not 3. Peter is confronted by a crowd of widows bearing Tabitha's service to them in their hands. They bring their eulogy, and it is a sign that Tabitha was one of those who understood that solidarity had to be radical and that generosity was for the least of these. This wasn't convenient service. This wasn't quick service. Clothing is the kind of service that can only happen when someone stays, when someone is committed, when someone is relentlessly dedicated to the very basic needs of the children of God. It takes a long time and a lot of resources to make one piece of clothing. So imagine how much time it takes Tabitha to clothe all these widows. I can't help but wonder how Peter feels when he's confronted with the evidence of Tabitha's service. You know, Peter, who never stayed in a place long or amongst a people long enough to actually know what they needed. Many of us grow up in traditions that laud the people like Peter, the charismatic speaker and the teacher who roams from town to town proclaiming the gospel and healing the sick. And even the non-religious amongst us have versions of this service. They're called community organizers. They give rousing speeches and they go on tours to gin up change amongst others. And this is good service. It is very good service. We need speakers and teachers and inspiring people to help us imagine the world in a new way. But we have lost the thread of Christian life if we don't hold up the service of people like Tabitha, the disciple, too. This is the service of staying. The service of being rooted in a community so deeply that you learn the names and the needs and the loves of the people who are forgotten and the people who are powerless. This is the service of staying, of utilizing your resources and your privilege not only to meet temporary needs, but to be able to meet ongoing and chronic needs that require a lot of resources to fix. It's service in the style of Jesus, who, though he, yes, did travel extensively, did so with the same 12 men for over 3 years, committed to teaching them every single day the things they still didn't really understand. It's the service of the style of God the Creator, in fact, who continued to accompany God's people past slavery and liberation, past occupation and corruption, past exile and return, into every moment and every home, beyond every betrayal, ever faithful. Since Easter Sunday, we've been contemplating the spiritual discipline of service, how true service is not obsessed with the big gestures, but often committed to the very mundane ones, and of how pride often keeps us from accepting the service we need. And the story of Tabitha, called Dorcas, invites us to consider how we've been treating service as a moment in time. One lunch handed out, one yard mowed, one child's shoelaces tied over again. Instead of properly understanding service as a commitment, long-term, to sharing life with our neighbors. That service is more often than not the decision to stay and the decision to become rooted in the long and sometimes arduous process of loving each other. Friends, the world is very big, and it is very complicated, and the needs are so many, and I'd wager if you're even a little like me, you feel a bit tossed about by all the suffering you cannot alleviate. How can you focus on any one thing when we're in an unending war? Were children born when it first began, my freshman year of college, are now on the same routes their fathers were in the army in Afghanistan? How can you focus when refugees are not only coming from Syria, they're coming from Venezuela, and they're coming from El Salvador, and they're coming from Mexico? How can you focus when our government abuses us and the environment in so many innumerable ways you can't even remember the last bad thing that happened because the next bad thing has already happened? How can you focus when creation is literally groaning underneath us at our cruel lashes? Our service becomes scattershot, and an attempt to do good for everybody on a surface level kind of way. And you get a lunch and you get a food, and now I have to go cry because I don't know what to do next. But what if we leaned into the story of Tabitha, learning from the grief of those who carried with them the clothes she made them? So this week, I need you to take stock of all the scattershot ways you are trying to be of service. And I'm betting that there's like 10 at least for each of you, things you're trying to do and feel like you're not doing well at any of them, right? Whether you are attending meetings or fostering animals or composting food or tutoring at schools or some other kind of avenue of care or all of those at once, I need you to ask, how focused are you truly on the service that God is actually calling you into? What would it be like, hypothetically, if you narrowed your service to just one arena of care and put your life into that? Immediately, are you apprehensive that if you don't start meeting all the needs of your community, then they're not all going to be met if you don't do it? I understand that concern. I'm in a generalist profession, okay? It makes me really anxious to think about just doing one thing. But it is secretly prideful of us to be so concerned that if we don't do everything, it won't happen, because it obscures the fact that you are just one, but you are one of many. You are one part of a whole body of faithful people, all of whom have a calling that is probably different from you to serve differently than you. You are not alone. You are not the only one called. I mean, was Tabitha the only Christian in Joppa? Did the widows of Joppa only need the clothing that Tabitha provided? No, of course not. Tabitha was one of many in her community, faithful in her way, meeting the needs she could, seemingly without feeling the need to try to do all things for all people. They only brought clothes. Nobody brought recipe books. Nobody brought baskets she'd made. Nobody brought stories about how she carried heavy stuff for them. They just brought clothes, and that was enough. You do not need to lead every moment, every movement. You do not need to give to every charity. You do not need to pull yourself thin and apart, believing that if you don't do the critical works of service, they won't get done. It's just not true. It's not. What the world needs from you and what God needs from you is focus. What does your community need that you can do? And once you know it, we'll settle down and do it. It may be you're the lady who makes clothes. It may be that you're the guy who makes sure lawns are mowed so nobody gets another notice from the city that they can't pay. It may be you're the person who makes sure people get out on bail on Mother's Day. It can be that simple, because simple can become all-encompassing. What Rachel Hall Evans did was focused service. She wrote and she spoke and she loved Jesus. And she leveraged her power and her privilege so that other people could write and speak and love Jesus. What my grandparents did was focused service. My grandfather ministered and then taught other ministers, and my grandmother loved her students, both her special ed kids and the prisoners in correspondence courses that she helped. What Jesus did was focused service, teaching and showing us about the liberation from the bondage we are in that is offered by God. You can be focused. You can be focused in service in the place where you live, with the people that surround you, and the gifts that you've been given. And who knows? One day at your funeral, the peoples whose lives you've changed with that service may bring forth their stories like cherished items of clothing. As a room full of people who loved you recount the ways that you showed up over and over and over again because you loved them.